Let's talk about why trust. We use it to do deals amongst ourselves. I can do a deal with you. I can come and appear on this stage because I trust you, to the extent that even though you want less trust, there's this sign out there saying less trust, you want more truth. I can still trust you enough that you're not going to throw me out or shoot at me or something like that, it's a big thing. It depends on the community you're in. I couldn't necessarily go to certain countries in this world and give certain talks about the activities they're doing and be trusted to not be arrested. The world is changing. We use trust to share information. I will share my information with you if I trust you, and you'll do the same thing. When we share information, we're exposing our vulnerabilities, and it really helps to be able to trust that person when we do that. We also use it all the time in introducing friends. I can introduce my friend to you confidently if I trust you and I trust my friend, but if I don't trust one of you, maybe I'm not going to introduce the friend. Maybe I'm going to be careful. These are all interesting things that kind of happen in the world of trust. And what I'm about today is trying to show you that actually we're in it, we can't get rid of it, and it's better to work with it than to work against it. So what is trust? Well, I'm going to use the characters Alice and Bob. That's the old cryptographic convention. Alice is always the first person. Bob is always the second person. So Alice will trust Bob to do some things. She might trust Bob to cook dinner, but she might not trust Bob to mind her kids. This is a sort of either-or thing. It could be this way, it could be the other way. Maybe she trusts Bob to look after the kids but not make dinner. It all depends. Now, the interesting thing about this is that whatever the answer is, Alice knows immediately, when she knows what the question is, what the answer is. Alice knows that she trusts Bob, just like that, to be able to handle a certain thing, which means that Alice knows something about Bob. When you trust somebody, you know something about that person. And you can pretty instantly figure out what the question is and how you're going to deal with it, which means that trust is really a tuple. It's four things put together. It's me, you, Alice, and Bob. It's a question. What sort of thing are we talking about? Dinner or kids or whatever. And it's a yes, no, maybe. All these things are instantly in Alice's head. And then there's things like vital statistics. That's what we used to call them. They're kind of out of fashion these days. So Alice trusts that Bob is male in this case. He's 176 centimeters, and he says he's 80 kilograms. But wait, no, that's not quite right. Alice knows that Bob is male, and he's 176 kilograms, and he's 84 kilograms. Sorry, 176 centimeters. It's 84 kilograms. She knows things about Bob, and they're different from trusting Bob. The things that she knows don't change day in, day out. Knowledge is something like a certainty, whereas trust has a doubt in it. You're not talking about trust unless there's some doubt, which means that knowledge is actually stronger than trust. And actually, there are many steps along the journey towards trust and knowledge. You can start out with nothing, basically. You don't know anything about this particular subject, but then you might have a suspicion. You might go through confusion. Everything seems to be confusing. It then comes into a suspicion, and maybe then you build a theory about how the world works on this particular question. And over time, the theory becomes a fair bit more reliable, and then you start to trust it until you move into the world of certainty, of knowledge, of knowing that, in fact, that is true and it will never change. So we're talking about an evolution of understanding that we all go through. And at the border of trust, there's some interesting things happening. To go from theory to trust means that you've got to go from complete confusion or uncertainty to the point where you can start to actually work with it. When we're convinced that a theory is solid, we move over to trust, but we're more about using the information. It could still work out, but the thing is that there's a chance with trust that it's not going to work out and you're going to lose. We try, we accept the consequences. And the thing that's going on here is that with trust, you're making a decision, and that decision is conscious, which means it's over a risk. Something can go wrong. You could win in this particular event, but you might not. You could lose out. There's some sort of risk there which you have to make a decision on, which is to say also, you have skin in the game. Alice could lose something, so therefore she's putting something on the line. Skin in the game is a really important concept when you're doing deals. So after Alice has made her decision on trust and taken on that risk and earned some form of reward or loss or whatever it is, she can analyze the process of what happened. And then in the next time that she comes up against Bob on this particular question or a similar question, she can use the results of that from the past round into the next round. So what it tells us is that trust is actually a repeating game. It happens all the time. It keeps happening. It's not a one-round thing. You don't do a trust decision on something you've not seen before, some person you've not seen before. You do it on somebody you've known for quite some time. So what we're looking at here is basically a feedback cycle. When you're doing something with trust, you're looking at the fact that there's a reward to be gained by putting yourself exposed in this particular situation. And after you've taken that reward, you analyze the situation in your mind, and then the next time that comes along, you do a decision to do it again, the whole thing again, and then on that decision you take on a risk. And I call this the RADR cycle of feedback, Alice's trust radar in short terms. So it goes from reward, analyze, decision, and risk. And this is actually a model of a thing called OODA. If there's any military people here, OODA is observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's the way that the old fighters used to work together. They would look at what was going on, observe where they are, orient their plane, and then try to decide, and so forth. And it becomes a loop. And the easy way of thinking about the loop is that the pilot that can spin faster in the loop of OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act, would beat the other pilot because they can spin inside. And it turns out this military model applies to most military aggressive situations, and it goes further than that. It applies to any adversarial situation you've got in the world, in your lives. The person who can spin fastest in the trust loop, if you like, has an advantage. So we can place some limits on this process as we decide that it's a repeating game, as we decide that we've got a concept of what Alice is doing. But if you widen it out to the wider world in which you're doing this repeating game, you've also got to have some factors on there. Firstly, identity or identification. We do have to know who Bob is. If it's a different Bob in the next round, it doesn't make any difference. It's not important. You have to be able to recognize Bob. And if you think in the internet context and the blockchain context, this becomes quite a serious limitation because we don't know who we're talking to, we don't know whether they've changed, etc. We have to have precision on the question that we're talking about. We are relying on knowing what it is that's happening here. What are we being asked to trust? We've got to have choice. Alice has got to face a series of choices. She can do nothing, she can trust, she can distrust, she can negotiate, she can walk away. There's all sorts of choices that she can have. If she doesn't have those choices, what's going on? Well, she's being forced along a certain line. So, for example, if you want to be trusted to drive a car on the streets, well, it turns out there's only one place you can get the license from. There's only one way you can get a driver's license. You have to go through tests and so forth. So there's no choice there. This isn't a trust decision at all. And the other thing is authority. Alice has got to decide to make the actual decision. If she doesn't have the authority and she doesn't use the authority, she's not in trust. She's been pushed into some sort of compliance decision, bullied into doing something, or whatever it is. That's not a real trust decision. So all of these factors, they limit the way we think about or act in terms of trust. So that's enough blah blah. Perhaps we can turn this into a definition, because definitions are good, they ground things. There's going to be a decision, has to be a decision. We're going to take a risk over a known person, so we do need to know who that person is. And there's got to be some substantial uncertainty in the process. And it's over that limited question or context in exchange for some benefit. There's got to be some enticement there. There's also got to be some chance of loss. It's got to be voluntary, so you've got to have that choice. You've got to be able to use your decision authority. And it's based on the history and experience you have with that person or with similar people over time. That's a lot of bullet points, so we can try it in different words. When Alice trusts Bob, she chooses to take a risk on Bob's actions in a limited context, based on her prior experience, in order to gain some benefit. Those are about as tight of a set of words as I could come up with. So all of this means that it's actually quite a dynamic thing. It's happening all the time, it's going on and on. There's a feedback cycle, there's evolution of your experiences. If you know your game theory, it's a many rounds game. It's an unbounded game, it keeps going on forever. So we need to think of that as a cycle. Now, when we start thinking about that, and we start talking about adversarial contexts, I mentioned before this military concept of OODA, what happens if somebody tries to break your trust? How do you break a person's trust? Well, it works this way. Bob comes along and says, okay, I know that Alice trusts me. I'm going to try and break through her trust model and get her to do something that's bad for her, perhaps. And what happens then is that Alice defends against that because she does recognize she's being abused in some fashion. So then Alice experiences this abuse and then starts modifying her behavior. But the way she does it is extremely deep and extremely close in her mental model. So she modifies her trust model, if you like, but she buries it deeper. And every time she's abused, she buries it deeper. Every time she gets into trouble, she modifies her model and pushes it further down into her psyche until she no longer recognizes what she's doing. She can't even find her trust model in her mind, but it's there. It's hidden deep. So the defense against abuse is to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how to handle that, which is what we do all the time as we're growing up, and to bury that deep. So that means that it's Heisenberggian, which is to say, if you touch it, you break it. If you touch some person's trust capability, you're going to break what's there. She'll rectify that and hide it away from you in the future, so you can't do that anymore. And that's important because there's a lot of people who talk about trust and say, hey, I'm going to do a trust system. Guess what? It doesn't work because you can't touch trust. So think about machines and so forth. Well, machines have trouble with this. They can't do trust because they're not human. They don't have that inner feedback cycle, that desire to be protected and defended against the world. And therefore, machines can't also interpose trust. They can't transfer trust from one place to another, because once it's handled out, once Alice opens herself up, she can only do that to a human. So it's not really possible, for example, to just package it all up and then hand it to a machine and have the machine hand it on to the next person. Trust is peer-to-peer, directly, face-to-face. And the problem, of course, is if a machine could do trust, and we're thinking now about AI and so forth, if a machine could figure out what's happening inside Alice's head, the machine could break her trust. So if you're thinking about, for example, the AIs of the future and so forth, you let them get too close, you let them get into your mind, into your trust model, they will take over. And if you think about the companies that can muster the size of models that are needed to do a very human interface, the bigger they are, well, you're going to have a problem there, because the companies will only align with their own profit models. They won't align with your needs. So literally, you can't get humans and machines in a trusted relationship like that. Okay, yeah. So there's been a lot of what we call so-called trust systems in the world. Trust has been tinkered with since the beginning of technology, the beginning of digital world. One of the big ones was PGP's Web of Trust. If you've been around in the 90s and the 2000s, you would have heard about how we sign each other's key, and we assign trust to having done that. And it turns out that, well, the model was fairly simple. When you signed a key, you would have a number that went 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you trusted them, you gave it 4. And if you didn't trust them, this person, you gave it 1. Well, what does that mean? Well, oddly enough, it turned out to mean several things. There was this group over in the US called the cypherpunks, and they said, yeah, it's okay to trust somebody's key, and they can have any name they like. You know, Mickey Mouse. You could have. There are a couple of famous pseudonyms, Black Unicorn and Lucky Green, are relatively famous people in the cypherpunks era who invented these names and then ran anonymously or pseudonymously around the world and did various things. And you would meet these people and sign their key on the basis that you met them, and they said their name was Black Unicorn or Lucky Green. Then over in Europe, there was a whole bunch of other people who said, well, that doesn't make any sense. I trust people's passports or ID cards. So you'd have these PGP key signing parties where there'd be a big long line of people and then another big long line of people facing each other. And they would show each other the passport and the key ID, and then you would record that, and then everybody would shuffle along and do the same thing again until you'd seen everybody in the line, and then you trusted, you signed everybody's key later in the day. So we had what was strangely a complete mismatch inside the trust system. The PGP people in the US said, oh, you can be anybody, it's just if we've met and you've introduced yourself as some crazy thing like Mickey Mouse. Or in Europe, you had to show the passport, so that was the only trusted symbol that was allowed. And for that reason, it turned out that PGP's Web of Trust really wasn't that trustworthy, because nobody knew what was on there when you saw somebody's key. They didn't write it down, so therefore it could be anything, and to many people it was anything. So what does all that mean? Not a lot. PGP's trust system, Web of Trust, never really worked. Now, PKI, by that we mean browsing, web servers, SSL, X509, all that sort of stuff, didn't have that problem. They wrote down what was meant inside their system of trust. They called it a trust business. But that didn't work either, for very complicated business reasons. And I'll try and compress it down to a few minutes rather than the years it would take to understand what went wrong with PKI. But basically, the certificate that was issued by CAs, certification authorities, to web servers or to individuals said, this is your government-approved name. So you had to turn up with government-approved documents like your ID card if you're in Europe, or your certificate of authorization if you're a company, for example. They would check all these things and then sign authoritatively that you are this person and you have a certificate now and you can present yourself on the web and start doing e-commerce. Now, the problem with that is that it became a liability trap. The certification authorities realized that if there was any liability for these millions of numbers that they'd issued, then it would go to pot. Which is to say, if you think about the millions of web servers that are out there, imagine there was a class break. Imagine somebody made a mistake and it could all be spoofed. And suddenly Amazon's certificate was broken, eBay's certificate was broken, Facebook's certificate was broken. The liabilities for that would be uncontainable. So the only way that works is if the liability is set to 0. 0 times millions is still 0. So consequently, what happened with the CAs is that they found themselves in this liability trap. They set the liability to 0, which meant that the certificate that was given to you was worthless. If something went wrong, you couldn't solve it. You couldn't go to them and say, give me back my money. So in the end, it became certificate manufacturing. Everybody pumped these things out. And basically, everybody fell for the fraud. All the browsers were tricked into the process of saying you must have certificates. All the servers were tricked into the process of saying you must have certificates. And the CAs sat in the middle and convinced each side that the other side wanted it. Not really workable. This whole thing didn't really unravel until one particular player was on both sides of the fence. Had browsers, or users with lots of browsers, and had lots of websites. And that player was Google. Google had a browser and lots of websites, and then they could finally start to coordinate between the two and say, wait on a minute, what are we doing here? They didn't really solve it, but anyway. Blockchain, here we are, Web3. And I would say here that one of the biggest mistakes of blockchain and of Web3 is to say less trust. You can't get rid of trust. Trust is in all of us. By hiding from it, you're actually making it a less trustworthy place. And that's at the root of why it has taken so long for blockchain and Web3 and all those other ones to surface real use cases. Because you've hidden from trust. You've hidden from people. You're trying to do it all as a machine, but a machine can't do it. It can't be trustworthy. So when you want to get forward and start building real use cases, you've got to consider the fact that you're working for people and people want to trust each other. So how are you going to do that? It's a big question, isn't it? There's other forms of trust. The nation state loves their identity documents. But they're not as useful to the rest of the world. They're authoritative to the government, but all you've really got is this symbol. And if you start working through the layers of what happens when you hold this identity card, what's it useful for? Well, you know the name of the person. And what can you do with that? Pretty much all you can do is trust that this person is scared enough not to do anything wrong. If they do something wrong, you can go to the courts. Now about that, going to the courts is actually very expensive. So this identity document thing only works for us in a trusted context if we've got a lot of money, which means it's only going to work if there's a lot of money robbed. And then you think about blockchain, the internet. What happens if the guy is in another country? Oh, the cost of a dispute just went up by a 0 or 2. Now we're talking millions of dollars. So your ID document really isn't a particularly useful base for a trusted system. And the courts themselves, well, they're losing trust. We as a society are built as an inverted pyramid where the fulcrum, the point down the bottom which we're all leaning on, is the system of courts. If somebody does something wrong, then we can go to court and rectify that. We can get an answer. But as the courts are slowly moving away from what we think is trustworthy behavior, then this is a problem. CA Cert on Facebook, I'll talk about them in a minute. Then there's all sorts of other things for trust. I was going to wear a suit, but it's just too damn warm. A suit is a signal, it's a symbol that I'm one of all the suited people, and therefore apparently suited people are trustworthy. Everybody does the same thing. If you wear a hoodie, that means you're one of the local young people. You're signaling that you're one of the same thing, of a particular tribe. Today I've got a white badge. Apparently you guys have got black badges. Therefore, I'm more trustworthy? I don't know. I'm signaling something with my white badge, and we do this all the time. It's called fashion in some places, but actually I'd call it signaling trust. What's that? Does anybody recognize that that's up there? Anybody got their hand up? I can't see, actually. Is Trent in the audience? Yeah, you recognize it. Do you have one? Yes. You do? Are you wearing it today? Ah. All right. That is the iron ring. You'll see that it's got facets cut out of the side of it such that it's got little points on. The little points will hit onto things. You wear it on the little finger. So when you're doing work, and this is going back to the days when we did it all with paper and pen, the ring would attack the paper and remind you that you're wearing the iron ring. The iron ring was given as the calling to engineers in a particular country, Canada. Trent's from Canada. And what it meant was, you are to remember at all times you are an engineer. You are trusted by society to do the right thing. You're trusted to complete the job, not cut costs, not cause a failure, and not kill people. That is a trust system, or a symbol of trust. And it works very well. Blockchain engineers do not wear the iron ring. So, summarizing all this trust stuff, it's far more complicated than we realized. We've kind of internalized all the knowledge. We've kind of forgotten where it's all come from. And we think we can replace it because that sounds cool. Well, actually, I don't think so. It's based on past performance. There's got to be some deep things going on here, circumstances, personal knowledge. You all are going to be exercising your trust machine when you get to the bar, when you get to the coffee room. This is going to go on and on. It's started at the beginning of your lives. It's going to go on till the end of your lives. It is a feedback loop. It's going on all the time. And it's both a momentary decision which you make instantly, and it's something that repeats over and over again. So we can define it, if you like. This definition that I've come up with is just my definition, having explored it. You could come up with a different definition. But we can't model it. We reach fundamental barriers. I can build an AI to attack your trust machine and try and get into your insides, into your mind. But you're going to defend against that. You're going to push back. So what's the point of my model? And you could say, for example, that governments are using Facebook and places like that to get into your trust machine by sending all these messages out, especially during elections. It's now common for governments to facilitate elections by helping you choose the right party. This has happened in the US several times and in various European countries. But it is rather Heisenbergian. When we touch it, things go wrong, and we have to fundamentally be aware of that. We're not invited to break somebody's model. We shouldn't do it, and if we do it, they're going to fight back. And Alice will move to bury it deeper and deeper. As she moves and repairs and buries deeper, what happens is, of course, she's rejecting the whole system of what's going on. So for this reason, systems of trust generally fail. And we've got 30, 40 years of internet experience where people have come up and said, I'm going to do a trust system, and they fail. And this is the reason. We won't, as individuals, let the machine dictate our trust. But there's some notable successes. We have had some successes. And I can think of 3, 2.5 perhaps, on the internet. CoCert. Anybody here remember CoCert? Maybe. Okay, CoCert was a big organization, started out of Australia, migrated to Germany, and what it was a certification authority doing those certificates, which weren't a particularly trusted thing. But we did it as an organization, as a foundation, as an association. We were doing it for ourselves. And what we had was something like 5,000 assurers around the world, running around checking your documents and awarding you points for being who you were. To get that audited, we added a thing called arbitration. And that's because when we were looking at the whole game of certification authorities, we asked the question, how do I trust this thing? How do I know it's got value? The certification authorities dumped the liability on you, so it had no value. Now, what does it mean if an association, a group of people, a forum, decides to dump the liability on itself? It can't be done. We can't make our lives worse by dumping our own liability on ourselves. So what we did to add value to the certificate was to start arbitration. Arbitration is this sort of thing where you reach into the courts and you say, sorry mate, taking it back. We are going to do it all ourselves. This is supported in law. Every country has an arbitration act. And what it means is you set up your own courts, literally. We appointed arbitrators from amongst the community. We had rules for it. They followed a particular law, and they handled all the disputes. This turned out to be stunningly popular. You may be scared at these thoughts that we're going to do our own courts. Wow, that could be really dangerous, scary. But it turns out everybody had a problem, and everybody wanted to solve that problem in disputes. And our arbitrators would stand there and say, you've got a dispute. I'll hear both sides. I'll issue an award or a ruling, and that solves the problem. Things we couldn't solve in paper could be solved in disputes. Things we couldn't solve in cryptography could be solved in disputes. And what happened was, because we knew that we could always create a dispute if something went wrong, we knew that everybody in the organization could be trusted, because we finally could make use of the courts because we had our own courts. People acted better. They acted more professionally. They stood up and were responsible for what they did. And we solved more problems more quickly. It was incredibly successful. It's the world's only internet-trusted society. It cracked how to do trust. Then there's Facebook. Facebook's really odd. I guess you've all seen the movie, The Social Network, the Facebook movie. You should see that movie, because if anything, it's the best description of our world, of our technophiliac world, where we are techies, we're all together, we're crowded onto one particular idea, we're going to make it or break it, and we end up breaking a lot of things. It's a fantastic movie to describe who we are. You might remember Zuckerberg goes out there, comes home drunk one night, or gets drunk, and he decides to put up on his screen the pictures of 2 women. And he says, okay, this is called face mash. Pick which woman is hotter. Hot to the left, hot to the right, swipe, whatever it is. And this has turned out to be an actual very popular app later on. But at that time, it was a little bit radical. So he invents this game, casts it out to Harvard University, and suddenly it just blows up in popularity because all the guys are doing click yes, click no, click left, click right. They're choosing the women. And of course the women respond by getting very upset and cause chaos and he gets punished. He gets ground into the dust. He gets kicked out of Harvard, suspended for a semester, and he has to go up before the board of this and the board of that. So he really gets pummeled into the ground by this. This is a case of Alice defending herself from her trust being abused, and he learns from this lesson. A bit later on, he comes up with this notion that, there's something really trustworthy about being in Harvard, and if we can only pin that down and say, okay, I know who you are, you can come in and talk to me or do something. So he invents this system whereby you get an account and you get to put your face picture on there, and you do a few details, and then there's this wall where you can start communicating, and boom, Facebook takes off. But what happens? Why did that work? It worked because the men and the women had this thing going on where the men would chase the women. And the women got annoyed about this, but they still wanted to be in the game, but they didn't want to be face-to-face in the game. So they discovered they could set up their Facebook page, present themselves, just like they present themselves every day, but at a distance. So now what we had was a compromise, whereby the women felt safe inside their Facebook page, the men had to be dragged in because they wanted to speak to the women, and the women just said, Facebook me. Contact me on Facebook. And now they felt safer. It worked. So that was actually a system that managed to align itself with our natural trust expectations. Of course, Facebook these days is something completely different, but at the time, it was radical, and it succeeded for that very good reason. So, where do we go next? So trust is in Alice's mind. It's in all of your minds. It's closely related to your identity, which is how I came on this particular story. And the reason this is interesting is because we were looking at a particular group of people who were sharing their identity with each other in ways which were unexpected. And after a lot of rationale and discussion and so forth, it turned out they were sharing their identity because they trusted these people. You will share your identity, yourself, your vulnerability with somebody who you can trust. So it turns out that to do an identity system, I reasoned, you need to have a trust system. Somehow you've got to solve the trust problem in order to solve the identity problem. But then you start thinking about what identity is, and you find that identity is really two things in contradiction. One is the identity in your mind. It's the way I think of myself. It's the way you all think of yourselves. The other thing is the identity that is of oneself, but it's in the heads of everybody else. You all think of me in a certain fashion. I can't see that because it's in your heads. I think of you in a certain fashion. So there's two completely different senses of identity going on here, and they're in collision. So in trying to do that, you think about the way this works. Say you want to build an identity system, that particular trope that everybody talks about, and it's coming, and it won't be very good. I can't do the identity system based on what's in my head, because nobody wants to be that invasive. But I can do the identity system on the basis of what you see of me. And I can do this because you make comments. You communicate amongst each other. So we can talk about the notion that if you talk amongst yourselves about me, and I take all those comments and I place them on a blank sheet of paper and paint those comments on there, I have now a graph, if you like, of who I am. So we could do identity on that basis, and that's the core, if you like, insight in what is known as verifiable credentials. The self-sovereign individual people have tried to create this sense of identity whereby they collect the things that people say about each other, paint them onto a blank canvas. to construct who that person is. It's got problems, as all these stories do. But it turns out there's a contradiction here, because to understand identity, I have to understand who trusts each other, so I need a trust system. To understand trust, I need to know who Bob is, so I need an identity system in order to build a trust system. The two have to come together, and maybe they are the same thing. Maybe trust and identity are the same coin, but they're just the front and the back of the same coin. So it's a contradiction, or it's an equality, we don't know. Another thing to bear in mind is that when you build a trusted relationship, there's a thing called Robin Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is 150. Because we're techies, we're technical people, let's think of it as 150 slots in a database. The database is in our mind. Dunbar says that that's how big our mind is in terms of the number of slots for the number of relationships we can have. Strong relationships. I can know approximately 150 people, give or take, and know them well and have a strong relationship. So it's like, if I want to meet somebody new today, I have to push somebody out of my slot, out of their slot, to make room for this person. Our brains have limited capacity for deep relationships. And Dunbar says it's about 150. It's fascinating research. But then that means that Alice has got a problem. In order to do trust on a social scale, on a big scale, on a planetary scale, she has to economize. She can only really develop proper trust up to 150. So how's she going to do that? And the way she does that is in groups. She has groups built of personal trust, which is an important point, which is where I'm heading in my research, and I'd suggest you think about that for your research. But there's a more fundamental question that I'd like to bring up beforehand, before we get there, and that is, where did this trust come from? I've said you've all got trust in your heads. You're all doing it all the time when you meet people. Where did it come from, though? How did you get it? So here's the hint. The hint is a 0-day-old baby, somebody who's been born today, doesn't have the capability to trust at all. All they can do is cry and feed from mother's breasts. That's about it. Now, if you go forward, fast forward 20 years and you think about Alice as an adult, as you all are here today, you can all do the trust thing. So something happened between day 0 and year 20 to create the trust thing. And it turns out the answer is quite simple. Upbringing. You were all brought up, we were all brought up to do the trust thing. And in fact, you could say that upbringing was all about trust. Once you could do trust of your peers, of your friends, of your teachers, of everybody, then, gosh, you could do anything, because you can take the information from who you trust. It starts with mother being with the baby. The baby doesn't have trust, but there's this full trust substitute called love, which the mother triggers in the baby, keeps it alive by the swamping of the baby with love until the baby is old enough to start talking and doing things and so forth. And the mother teaches the child all the things that has to be done. The mother introduces the child to father, whose primary contribution at this point is to show the baby that there are people in the world. When the baby had mother, there was no such thing as people. There was just whatever there is. When there's only one, there is an absence of anything. Only when you've got the father also playing the game does the baby start to understand, wait a minute, mother isn't everything, mother is not father, father is not mother, there are people in the world. So it's the start of a very long journey to understand who people are and to learn to trust them. Siblings get introduced, uncles, aunts, cousins. So the end story about this is actually Alice's mind was hardwired from the beginning to work in a group called family. And Alice's evolution into the world as an adult is to step outside her family and find another group. It turns out that groups are built into the mind going back since forever. So, if you like, what we're saying here is not only is trust built into the mind, so much so that you can't get rid of it, groups are also built into the mind's capability because that's the only way we can manage the diseconomies of scale of trust. So there's a lot of work to do to figure out then how to bring trust into the scene. And I'll just finish briefly with an anecdote. I discovered this in Kenya, where we discovered that there was huge amounts of corruption. So I asked the people there, how can you cope with the corruption? You can't save money, you can't do this, you can't do that. They said to me, we have our chamas. Chama is a Swahili word for group. And to cut a long story short, what happened was the women have the long view. They have to get their kids to school to educate them. That costs two big payments, one at the beginning of the year and one in the middle of the year. They cannot save that money because it's so corrupt. The husband will steal the money. The children will steal the money. The neighbors will come and borrow it. The only way they can save money is to come together in groups, trusted groups, they import the trust in, and then they discipline themselves by saving amongst themselves. Those groups are extremely heavily trusted within themselves. Outside the groups, zero trust. And that's what launched me on this journey to try and figure out trust and identity and Alice and evolution and upbringing and so forth. So that's the end. This is all in a book which I've called Identity Cycle. You can scan that or follow that link and it'll take you through the entire journey as to why trust is really important and why I think blockchain made a huge decision, an error, to try and get rid of trust when really we should be learning to work with trust and especially learn to work with groups. Thank you.